Okay, so we're going to start today with Colonial Unity. That's chapter 2, section 2, if you're following along that way. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I want to cover here is the essential question. So there's that to get down. Again, this is chapter 2, section 2, start a colonial unity. So the essential question here is, what actions from the colonists in Great Britain led to the American Revolution and the beginning of the United States of America? So finally, we are moving and progressing into the United States of America. We can start really honing in on what the United States is and what we are founded on. So let's zoom in on that essential question here. It's very important. There's going to be some very fine wordage here because technically America doesn't exist yet. So we're talking about colonists and they are technically British citizens. So while we're going through this, try and keep it clear as to which group of people is being talked about at that given time. Of course, if you need any time to pause and go back, go ahead and pause that video or this video and feel free to get those notes down, get down what I'm saying, and then unpause the video and continue. So colonies on their own. All right, the colonies on their own. So first we have Britain. And what happens here is Britain begins to tighten its control over the colonies. So in the eyes of Great Britain, the colonies only existed for the economic benefit of Great Britain. It was sort of like an outpost of Great Britain. The United States existed to produce certain crops and certain goods that maybe weren't able to be produced in Britain or anywhere in England. So they were really looked at as a place where Great Britain could make a good deal of money. To the mid 1700s, however, the colonies essentially governed themselves. So they had to pay their taxes and they still had to follow British law, and they were technically under British Parliament and were British citizens. But they had their own governments set up, as we've talked about. They had their first legislature in the Virginia House of Burgess and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is the first formal constitution. They had the general fundamentals, first basic system of laws. They had all of these things. And these are all great examples of the colonists governing themselves until the mid 1700s. And that's where things kind of fall apart here. And there are really two major events that caused it to fall apart, that changed the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies. The first of which is definitely something you have heard of, but we're going to dive into a little bit deeper. And it's one of the only wars we get to talk about in depth, the French and Indian War. And this is from 1754 to 1763. Now, despite the name there, this war was not fought between the French and the Indians. It was fought between the French and Great Britain over lands in the colonies. But it originally started as a struggle over land in western Pennsylvania and Ohio. So originally started as a struggle over land in western Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now, it doesn't seem like very important land, especially because we're from this territory, but at this time, this was the gateway to the West. You couldn't go anywhere west of where there were civilizations and settlements without going through western Pennsylvania and Ohio. They also had connections to the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, which eventually connects to the Mississippi down to the Gulf. So it was a very important area in which they were having a conflict over. And it eventually sort of exploded into a very major conflict. Okay. King George III, so the second thing here, the second big change that led to the fallout of Great Britain and the colonists was that King George III had different ideas on how the colonies should be governed. He didn't think that the colonies should just be left alone and that they should be able to govern themselves. He said, hey, they're British citizens and they should have to listen and follow what I say because I make the rules. So he really wanted to show the Americas who was boss, so to speak. The defeat of the French in the French and Indian War by Great Britain meant the colonists no longer needed protection from Great Britain, which was Great Britain's biggest asset over the colonists, was that the colonists needed protection from other threats. Excuse me. But once Britain removed that threat, the major threat being the French, then the colonists didn't really need Britain anymore. But Britain expected the colonies to repay them. All right, so here's where it gets a little confusing. Britain expected the colonists to repay Britain the large war debt that the French and Indian War cost. And that was because they said, hey, we fought this war because of you. You should have to pay for it. And the colonists are saying, yeah, you're here to protect us, but we are also British citizens. So why do we have to pay for the war if the people in Great Britain aren't paying for the war? We paid for Great Britain's war against other places in Europe. So it was really an unfair way to institute a tax and require the colonists to pay for the war. It was because the colonies were essentially paying for their war without the help of the British citizenry in Europe, whereas the colonists were expected to help with European wars. So kind of a double standard there. So taxing in the colonies. When King George III took the throne, he was determined to have those colonists pay for the war like we were just talking about. But the key question here is, how did he want the colonists to pay for the war? So the first thing he did was called it the Stamp Act. And it imposed the first direct tax on the colonists. Now, this Stamp Act sounds like it was just on stamps, but really this was a tax on anything that was paper-based, any official documents, any paper that you wanted to write on, anything. And it was a tax only to the colonists in the colonies. This was not a tax that was being put in place in Great Britain. This was specifically for the colonists and the colonists only. So very unique tax system. Notice here, however, that the colonists had absolutely no say in whether or not they were going to be taxed. Absolutely none. And this is a very key thing because it is a part of the American Revolution. So keep that in mind as we're going through this, that the colonists had absolutely no say and whether they were being taxed or not. And we've talked about consent of the governed and how important that is to legitimize power. And once that legitimacy is gone, once the governed do not consent to your power, then that's when things start happening. So, of course, they added a new tax, so their revenue increased. Now, some of you might be saying, Mr. Lunsford, what's revenue? And that's a good question. So revenue is basically the amount of money that a country or that a business or that somebody brings in. So it's before you pay your bills. It's just the amount of money you make. Now, of course, they have a new tax, so they're making more money. It makes a lot of sense. However, colonial resentment also increased, obviously, because they're paying a tax that the rest of Great Britain is not responsible for paying. So even though Britain is making more money, the colonists are becoming upset. And this goes back to what I was saying about Britain viewing the colonies as a way to make money, to benefit financially. This resentment caused Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. They said, hey, the colonists, we hear you. We understand what you're saying. We're going to repeal the Stamp Act. We're going to take it away because we realize we messed up. Now, this wasn't something out of the kindness of their hearts. They had something planned behind the scenes. So a lot of other tax laws quickly took the place of the Stamp Act. And we're going to talk about those very soon. So, very important to understand here, they imposed a tax that the colonists did not agree with. So, we're missing consent of the governed here. Britain viewed the colonies as a way to make more money, so they were making more money, but they underestimated the resentment. And once they realized the resentment of the colonists to the Stamp Act, they repealed it, and they kind of came back with a new plan, new ideas. So one of those things was a tea tax. So there was a tax on tea that the colonists thought was unfair because, again, they were only being taxed in the colonies, not in Great Britain. So in 1773, as a demonstration of that tea tax, the colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians, and they dumped 342 chests of British tea into the Boston Harbor and made the world's largest cup of tea. So some of you may be asking, why did they dress up as Mohawk Indians? Now, if you think about it, it does make a little bit of sense why they did this, but the main reason was so that the colonists would not be blamed for this. And it sort of worked. The British believed that the Indians, the Native Americans, were responsible for dumping the tea into the harbor for months after the fact, until some of them were captured. Some of the colonists were captured, and they found out that they were dressed up as Mohawk Indians, and then that information got back to Great Britain, and they eventually figured out that it was the colonists that had dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor. But this was just a show of resentment again against this tea tax. And what's really incredible about this is that not only was this the colonists showing Great Britain that they were against the tea tax, but this also demonstrates the first time the colonies have blatantly cost the British government huge sums of money with a protest. And as I said earlier, and it's important to understand that Britain viewed the colonies as a way to make money. So not only did they not make money, not only did they not break even, they lost huge sums of money. And if Britain only recognizes and believes the colonies exist for their financial gain, then they are going to start having some resentment towards the colonists. And that's exactly what happened. What the colonists did here, or excuse me, what Great Britain did next was called the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts as they were known in the colonies. And they passed this, which closed the Boston Harbor, which was the harbor in which the Boston Tea Party took place. And they withdrew Massachusetts's ability to self-govern, which of course is the state in which Boston and the Boston Harbor are in. So the ability to self-govern is what's really, really important here, because as I said earlier, the colonies mainly governed themselves for the entirety of the colony's existence. And now, all of a sudden, Massachusetts loses its government 100% and has to abide by 100% whatever Great Britain says, whatever King George III says. So this causes colonial resentment. And this is sort of the pattern here. And I've omitted quite a few events that weren't as major just to kind of get us to the point. But there were some jockeying back and forth, so to speak. Some here's some power, we don't like it, so here's how we're going to react. Well, here's some more power kind of thing. And the Coercive Acts were sort of the breaking point for the colonists. So before we really get into the juicy stuff, let's talk a little bit here about colonial plans for unity. Now, before the mid-1750s, most colonists believed themselves as British, and they recognized themselves as British citizens. But they also started to develop this idea of they were New Yorkers. So people from New York were, I'm a New Yorker, or people from Ohio, if Ohio existed at this time, would have said, we're Ohioans. So their identity was British and whatever state they were from in the colonies. So this caused those attempts to unify to fail at first, specifically the Albany Plan developed by Benjamin Franklin. who tried to unite the colonies, but it gave just way too much power to the representatives, who were way overpowered compared to the executive and judicial branches in that plan. So the colonists didn't like it. So it's very easy to see how these events and the way Great Britain was reacting was sort of drew Americans together, because there's nothing Americans do better than complain about other people and hate other groups of people, because that's the American way, of course. So by the 1760s, however, these harsh British policies, Stamp Act and the Tea Tax and the Intolerable Acts, the ones that we've talked about so far, caused the colonists to sort of say, hey, it's us against them. We are Americans. We are Americans now, united by their hostility of Britain, because there's nothing that unites Americans more like hating same groups of people. Always brings Americans together every single time. So don't underestimate the power of mutual hatred of one group as it pertains to Americans, because this was the spark. These policies really kind of got Americans up and really said, hey, let's go do something. Let's get something done here. So that's where we're going to leave off for this video. And then the next video, we will talk about the First and Second Continental Congresses and declaring our independence. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you soon.